listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. Here's your host, Dr. Mike Chupp.
Well, welcome back to CMDA Matters. You know, in our U.S. culture today, there are a handful of topics that just keep coming to the foreground on a regular basis for us. And one of those topics is the current mental health crisis, especially as it impacts children and adolescents, as well as their parents. And oftentimes the topic of mental health directly correlates to the pervasive transgender ideology that is taking over our culture and unfortunately even our profession. For this week's episode, we're discussing the impact of kids with mental health disorders and their families who genuinely want to be involved in their churches, as well as how mental health relates to gender and identity. Our special guest on this week's episode is Dr. Steve Grcevich. He's a child and adolescent psychiatrist who discovered CMDA and our psychiatry section actually later in his career. I'll share a little more about Dr. Grcevich as we welcome him to the program, so let's jump right in to our conversation today. Well, today on CMDA Matters, I am joined by frequent co-host Dr. Jeff Barrows, our Senior Vice President of Bioethics and Public Policy, because we have a guest who just happens to share a passion that Jeff has for the Ohio State
Go Bucks.
Go Bucks, Buckeyes. Dr. Steve Grcevich is a physician and a professor, a researcher from Northeast Ohio Medical University, is a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and also is president and founder of Key Ministry, which we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes. He's actually program chair for disability and the church and mental health and the church within the Key Ministry. Been in practice for over 3 decades, and as liaison with the medical school there in Northeast Ohio, shares with students and teaches students on how to deal with evidence-based medicine. So, Dr. Steve Grcevich, thanks for joining us on CMDA Matters this week.
Well, Mike and Jeff, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored and very appreciative of this opportunity to share.
Well, let's launch by talking about this ministry that you founded some time ago. Tell us a little bit about the purpose of that ministry and why you decided to start it.
Sure. So Key Ministry has been in existence now for a little over 20 years. And our focus is working with churches to help them welcome, serve, include, and share the gospel with families who have children with disabilities, with a unique focus on quote unquote hidden disabilities, any emotional, behavioral, developmental, or neurologic conditions where there aren't outwardly apparent physical symptoms. And I have to admit that when I graduated medical school and got involved with the church, I can't say that I ever envisioned having this kind of career in ministry. But part of how this got started was, and this is probably about a quarter century ago now, I was serving on the elder board at our church, and we had a large cohort of families in the mid to late 1990s, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, who went to Russia and Bulgaria and adopted kids who had some, very, complex medical, neurological, emotional, and behavioral issues. And these were like stalwart families in the church. I mean, these are folks who had been involved in leadership. They were highly committed, had been very involved in serving. And I'm sitting in an elder board one night, and the woman who at the time was leading our family ministry efforts came in and was talking about some of the challenges that these families were having staying involved with church, specifically because the issues that they were having with their kids were getting in the way of them being able to attend worship, to stay involved with like their small groups, or to serve in the capacities they've been serving. So I'm sitting there listening to this, and at the time I was running a fairly large multidisciplinary child psychiatry group in suburban Cleveland. And I'm thinking, I wonder how much of an issue this is for the kinds of kids and families who are coming through a practice like ours. And at the time, probably the three or four most common things that we were dealing with would be kids with anxiety, kids with ADHD, kids with mood disorders like depression or bipolar disorder, and kids on the high end of the autism spectrum. And so in an informal way over the next few months, one of the things that I did as family cycled through our practice for follow-up is that I asked each of them one question. And the question was, did the problems that led you to come to our practice significantly impact your family's ability to attend church, or your place of worship? And I was floored by the stories that I started hearing from folks. And so, as God would orchestrate things, it was around that time I had one of the three original research grants for Adderall. And so that there was a period of time where I was spending a lot of time traveling around doing grand rounds, doing other lectures for healthcare professionals. And wherever I would go, I would start talking a little bit about some of the work that our church was doing in terms of trying to support families in situations like these. And the church started getting inundated with requests from around the country for help. That's how Key Ministry got started. Mm-hmm. And again, it's, helping churches to be able to recognize the need that's out there in terms of the imperative for sharing the gospel, and then the imperative for supporting families in terms of being fully engaged and involved in Bible-believing churches where they can hear the gospel preached, they can come to faith, and they have the opportunity to grow in faith and then to use their gifts and talents to serve other people.
Well, Dr. Grcevich, in the midst of what sounds like an extremely busy schedule, you have also written a book, and it's entitled Mental Health in the Church, a ministry handbook for including children and adults with ADHD, anxiety, mood disorders, and other common mental health conditions. And your title implies that you believe that the church has not done as good a job as possible in addressing mental health problems, and also the whole part of the reason for starting Key Ministry. So I guess I want to check, is that your perspective? And if so, can you talk to us about the premise of the book?
So, it's not just that I believe that the church has a role here. It's that we have an overwhelming amount of evidence at this point that argues, in my belief, that families who are impacted by mental illness may in fact be the largest underserved population by the church in North America. There was a study that was published now about 6 years ago based upon over 250,000 interviews conducted as part of the National Children's Health Survey. And it turns out one of the questions that they ask as part of that survey is, has your family attended a church or place of worship at any point in the last year? And so Andrew Whitehead, who's a sociologist who's become better known for some other things, is actually the father of two sons with autism. So he did a deep dive looking at the data from National Children's Health Survey, looking at the relationship between the presence in the home of a child with a disability and family church attendance. And I think, to nobody's surprise who operates in my world, having a child with an autism spectrum disorder decreases the likelihood that a family will set foot in church by 84%. But it's 73% if you have a kid with depression. It's 55% if you have a kid with a disruptive behavior disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, or conduct disorder. 45% if you have a child with an anxiety disorder. And it's around 20% if you have a child with ADD or ADHD. While we don't have as much data on this in adults, there is data from the 2011 Baylor study of religion that suggests that when you look at adults who have symptoms of anxiety or depression, On any given Sunday, they're somewhere between 50 to 60% less likely than their peers in the community to be at church. And so one of the things that we're hearing more of in the church, given the mental health crisis that our society is experiencing, is the need to do more to care for and support people who are in the church. And almost the entire thrust of what we've been doing mental health ministry-wise has, again, been associated with care and support of people who are already coming to church. I guess the burden that the Lord has given me is to try to help the church to recognize the need for the gospel among individuals and families who are impacted by these conditions, who aren't currently attending church. And so one of the things that our team at Key Ministry is doing on an annual basis, we hold an event called Disability in the Church, which is the largest disability ministry conference in North America each year. So this coming September 26th and 27th, we're doing our first annual Mental Health in the Church conference, which is going to be held in suburban Cleveland, specifically to try to blend these two ideas, to help people in the church integrate the need for better care and support of folks who have these struggles, who already identify as Christian and as part of the church, with the urgent need for evangelism and outreach to folks who are outside of the church. And so part of what the Mental Health in the Church book was an attempt to do was that we lay out a model for churches to pursue in developing specifically a mental health outreach and inclusion strategy in the communities that they serve.
Steve, if I could just ask you a quick follow-up question. Back in the 90s, my wife and I joined another couple in doing a book study by Dr. Larry Crabb. And many of our listeners will be familiar with Dr. Crabb, Christian, famous author, psychologist, who with his book Connecting was challenging and said, I may be sabotaging my career by writing this book among my peers, but challenge the church to get more engaged, and thinking this dichotomy that this is for professionals to deal with, not for the church. And that Larry said, we've been equipped by the Holy Spirit. God has equipped us as the body of Christ to connect with one another. And so are you still seeing a reticence in the church of Jesus today to get engaged in Holy Spirit giftedness in doing ministry with those who are suffering with mental health?
Well, yeah, I think that there's very clearly a reticence that when I look at the whole mental health ministry movement, we're about 15 years behind. And part of where that we particularly, the more traditional, theologically conservative, evangelical wing of the church have struggled is this notion about to what extent are some of the struggles that people have associated with mental health? Is this something that is neurobiological, or is this something that is indicative, for example, of someone's sin condition or indicative of a lack of faith? And John MacArthur recently has had some rather interesting things to say about whether or not these mental health conditions, and in particular, he talked a little bit about PTSD and war veterans as to whether or not this stuff is real. And one of the lasting struggles that we've had is that having a mental health condition is very much stigmatized in the church. There was a Lifeway study that was done about 10 years ago now, and they had surveyed several hundred unchurched adults. 55% of them disagreed with the statement that if they had a mental health issue, they would be welcome at church. So part of what we do in the book is that we take a look at, well, what are some of the things that get in the way of individuals and families who have these struggles being part of church? And part of the model is that we help churches to think about this in terms of 7 different barriers. Using a cultural model of disability, there are certain attributes about church culture that make it more difficult for folks who have some of these mental health struggles to fit in. And the first one, and one of the biggest ones, in fact, is the stigma. in the same Lifeway survey, they surveyed adult family members of other adults who had serious mental illness. And when they asked those families what their churches could do that would be most helpful to them, the number one answer was for their pastors to talk about these issues from the pulpit, because in doing so, it then gave them permission to share their struggles within the context of their relationships in the church and their small groups. Because a lot of folks apparently been under the assumption or continue to perceive that this is not something that people who are in the church are necessarily comfortable talking about with other church members. I think we've made some headway on that since the original Lifeway study was conducted back in 2013. But this stigma and the judgmental attitude that some leaders in the church have, I think represents a significant barrier to us in our evangelism and in our outreach efforts.
Mm-hmm. Well, Steve, as we take a deeper dive into the whole issue of mental health here in the United States, we do hear a great deal about the negative impact of social media, especially on our children and adolescents today. And I am thinking, for example, about a recent book that has come out and has gotten a fair amount of notoriety already by Dr. Jonathan Haidt. It's called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. I did want to ask, do you agree with Haidt that social media is causing an epidemic in our children today?
Oh, absolutely. I think the evidence is incontrovertible. If you look at the United States and Western culture and some of the things that Haidt presents in his book. And interestingly enough, I have a standing opportunity to do segments on the talk show on our morning Christian station here in Cleveland. And this is what we discussed this past Wednesday. And I would argue that for parents and families interested in mental health in their kids, this is probably the best book that I've read so far in the 2020s that drills down on some of these issues. So that in Haidt's book, he makes several arguments for why we've seen, the mental health crisis that we have in kids over the last 10 years. And clearly, in particular, the advent of smartphones. And around 2012, 2013, we reached a point where, sort of a tipping point, where the majority of teenagers have smartphones. And he makes a very compelling argument in the book and traces data, again, not just in the US, but across all other Western cultures, showing that there was a significant spike, in particular, in rates of anxiety, especially among girls, after smartphones got in the hands of our kids. That was one argument that he put forth in the book. He has some other pretty interesting and compelling arguments. And one of the other arguments that he makes is that we don't give kids enough opportunity to take risks, to explore the world, that our society as a whole, beginning in about the 1990s, became very overprotective of kids. And that one of the things that he's an advocate for is what some folks have described as quote unquote free range parenting. That we need to let kids have the opportunity to play without adult supervision. We need to actively encourage kids to be more independent. One of the points that I think he made that's very compelling is that many parents are very concerned about predators in the world, about allowing their kid to ride a bike in the neighborhood, to go to a playground unattended, to go down the street, to run errands, to go to a store. But our kids are much more likely to encounter predators online than they are in the real world. And so that part of the argument that he makes is, in addition to the images that kids are bombarded with and the way the algorithms that some of the apps and the various social media platforms use to feed images and ideas and information to kids, it's the combination of that with the excessively protective attitudes that we have about our kids that contributes to why we've seen the explosion in rates of anxiety that we have in recent years.
Well, Steve, you mentioned free-range parenting and letting our kids get out and explore and maybe take more risks. But in terms of your recommendations to parents of children, teens, young adults, in terms of the social media and their smartphones, I assume you deal with this every single week in an active practice and what you're telling parents. And I think sometimes as a parent, I've had 4 kids of my own, it is hard to avoid hypocrisy in this whole area because we as adults are so in tune with our smartphones and always on them. And so to tell our kids don't do this or that when we are not necessarily setting a good example. So tell me what you're telling these parents.
So one of the things I tell parents, and I'll get to the smartphone thing specifically in a minute, but when I think back over the last few years, one of the things I was most struck with when we were going through COVID is that kids learn how to deal with their anxiety by watching how parents deal with anxiety. And so one of the things I think that we have to be very conscious of, and Mike, you just touched on this, is that we have to model for our kids how to deal with, some of the challenges that we're all dealing with, in 2020's culture. An observation, and I think that there were legitimate reasons for this, but I can tell you that the kids that I saw who come from medical families were disproportionately impacted by anxiety during COVID. How we as adults view this, and how we deal with it, our kids learn from watching us how to cope with anxiety. So that would be the first point that I'd make. And our kids learn from watching us how to deal with technology. So if we don't want them using smartphones at dinner, we can't be checking our smartphones at dinner ourselves.
Before we continue with this week's episode, here's a special announcement for you. There is such value and encouragement in staying connected with other Christians in healthcare. That's why the root of CMDA's ministry is in campus and community ministries, because you shouldn't have to face the hardships and struggles of both your healthcare training and career alone. We are here to walk alongside you and be a resource. With more than 80 local ministry groups and over 320 campus chapters around the country, you can find connection with your colleagues through CMDA. For more information and how to find a group in your area, visit ccm.cmda.org. Among all of our various ministries, CMDA's specialty sections give you the unique opportunity to equip, network, and fellowship with colleagues in your specific healthcare specialty. Organized by CMDA members, the sections include the Addiction Medicine section, the Coalition of Christian Nurse Practitioners, the Psychiatry section, and more. You can find the full list of sections at cmda.org/specialty sections. And if you don't see a section for your specialty, new sections are currently under development with CMDA's campus and community ministries. Contact CCM at cmda.org for more information about getting involved or starting a section. Let's jump right back into this week's episode.
So some of the recommendations I thought that Pike made in his book make all kinds of sense based upon my read of the ever-expanding research literature dealing with this topic. He strongly recommends that kids not be given smartphones with internet access until they enter high school, and that they not be allowed to sign up for social media apps until they're at a minimum 16 years old. That one of the challenges here, though, is, and again, like working with kids who have mental health issues, and we have like a fair number of kids on the high end of the autism spectrum in my practice, that one of the things that's a challenge is that for a lot of our kids, the reality is that much of their social interaction now comes online. And where I think Haidt makes a really important point, and this is something that folks can think about in our schools and in our churches, Christians in position of leadership, is that it's very, very hard for individual parents to manage this issue alone. Because the reality is if their kid doesn't have a way of connecting and staying in touch with other kids, that in and of itself is going to be a problem. So that parents need to come together, and that this can happen, I think, through a church, through a Christian school. I think that one of the arguments that Haidt puts forward in the book is that schools, regardless of whether they're public or private, need to take a strong stand in this and eliminate the availability of smartphones and technology where kids can access social media during the course of the school day, so that they have opportunities, real world, in person, to be able to build the kinds of social skills that they're going to need to fully function and to reach their potential as adults. But part of what we need is it's very difficult for parents, an individual parent or individual family, to deal with this and to effectively respond to the pressure that they're going to have, that every other kid is doing this and this is where kids socialize. So I think that we need networks of parents to come together, to be unified in taking a stand about safe and appropriate access of technology for kids, so that if it's not just one family, but it's all the families or most of the families that are involved in a church's youth ministry or in a child's school, then we have a greater opportunity to be successful in terms of setting these kinds of healthy limits on kids.
Well, Steve, you and I in previous conversations have talked a little bit about your concern, especially with the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Psychiatric Association's approach to gender dysphoria. So I'd like you to take a couple of minutes and just elaborate on what those concerns are as a psychiatrist yourself.
So I graduated med school 38 years ago. And over the last couple of years, I have become so embarrassed and ashamed in a lot of ways by some of the trends that I see in our profession, where we've lost the ability to look at data objectively. In particular, a lot of folks who are in leadership positions in our professional society have essentially been hijacked by the sexual revolution and hijacked by a political agenda. And I think that this is probably most dramatized in terms of the approach that folks are taking to what's referred to as gender affirming care in kids. At the same time that we have nation across nation in Europe, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and most notably, you look at the situation in the UK, where the British Health Service recently shut down the Tavistock Clinic, which was the clinic that practiced gender medicine with kids from across the UK, in the conclusion of the extraordinarily well-sourced and documented CAS report, which incorporated, I believe, 7 different meta-analyses looking at the data associated with gender affirming care in kids, came to the conclusion that basically that there was no evidence to support what we were doing with these kids. And at the same time that our colleagues across Europe are looking at the data and questioning our approach to what I would argue is probably one of the most vulnerable subsets of kids that we see within the pediatric age group. But at the same time that they're slamming the brakes on this and calling attention to the fact that the data doesn't support what we've been doing, you see the professional societies here in the United States, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the Endocrine Society, are doubling down on these practices. And what are we doing? The concern that I have is that basically our profession is shooting its credibility to hell. And I'm also very concerned, and one of the reasons why I recently joined CMDA is that I think that it's very important that docs who are more evidence-based and more objective have places to get together and to resource and to connect with one another, to strengthen and support one another in terms of how we deal with issues like this. When the institutions that employ us and the institutions that are involved, in teaching the next generation of like med students and residents have all gone off the deep end in their embrace of a political agenda, losing their ability to objectively look at some of the research that's out there that should be guiding our care.
Both Jeff and I were at a conference a couple of years ago down in Dallas, our collaboration with Dallas Theological, and I sat next to a very senior level psychiatry resident. And he sat next to me and said, Mike, thank you for what you and CMDA are doing. And this conference is just such an oasis because it seems like I live in a different reality, a totally different reality in psychiatry right now. I think he was in Chicago and was just saying it's just such a refreshing thing to be around folks who are willing to allow this conversation to happen and to talk about evidence-based psychiatry. Would you talk to our listeners just a little bit about the association of mental health problems with those who identify as transgender, as well as, because it's in your sweet spot, neurodevelopmental disorders? I had an opportunity to see you and Miriam Grossman interact with John Stonestreet many months ago. Fantastic. And we'll put this in our show notes for our listeners. That particular 90-minute webinar, so much more than we can possibly dive into today with the time we have remaining. But just briefly hit the high points on the association of neurodevelopmental disability as well as mental health disorders in this population.
So let me start with the mental health disorder issue. One of the things that we know, and we did a town meeting on this at our Disability in the Church conference that was, in terms of an individual event, the number one largest thing in terms of the number of people who've signed up as an indication of interest. And that this is an extraordinarily vulnerable population. So we know this is a 2022 study that showed that kids who presented or identified, as having gender dysphoria, that 70% of them met criteria for at least one anxiety disorder. Close to 60% of them met criteria for major depression. Nearly half of them met criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. 56% of these kids were involved in chronic self-injurious types of behavior. There was a study that looked at the variance in mental health outcomes between kids with gender dysphoria and kids who identified as gay and lesbian. And nearly 20% of the variance specifically was attributed to the higher incidence of trauma among kids who have gender dysphoria. There was a large study in the UK looking at this issue with adults, and we know that adults who identify as transgender are 5 times more likely to have ADHD, 6 times more likely to have obsessive compulsive disorder, 5 times more likely to be on the autism spectrum, and 28 times more likely to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia compared to the general population. But part of why we brought this up and why it was such a hot topic at our disability ministry conference is that when you look at the Tavistock Clinic over in the UK, and one of the advantages that does exist when you have a system of like socialized healthcare is that all of the information is in a single database. And so that we know that on one screen that they used with kids at the Tavistock Clinic, 48% of them met criteria for at least a mild presentation of autism. And of the kids who were prescribed either puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones, 35% had diagnoses of moderate to severe autism,
Wow.
which was 17 times the base rate in the general population of kids in the UK at the time. And so the reality is that what do these people think that they're treating here? And that there are kids who, with a condition where maybe they experience their sense of being male or female differently than the rest of the world. And we're exposing these kids to particularly risky and unproven treatments with serious long-term consequences in many instances, it appears, without doing the kind of careful diagnostic assessment necessary to separate that out from other neurodevelopmental conditions. I mean, this is scandalous.
It is. It's amazing, the statistics that you're citing there. I did not know that. But Steve, as we bring this interview to a close, before we end, I do think it's important. You, as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, why do you think it's important for Christian healthcare professionals like yourself to get connected to organizations like CMDA?
One of the issues with the way that our professional societies have been captured by this ideology, I can tell you that for a number of years now, I don't feel like I belong at the child psychiatry meetings. And on a day-to-day basis, I'm running into more folks where it's becoming more and more difficult. Some very devoutly Christian colleagues who I know are afraid to speak up about stuff like this. One of the stories that hasn't received enough coverage is that when I was actively involved with more things with the Child Psychiatry Academy, one guy I worked with closely is Alan Josephson.
Yes, good friend of CMDA.
Who had been the president of the psychiatry section of CMDA. Again, he was chair of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of Louisville. 7 years ago, he gave a lecture in Washington, D.C., arguing for a conservative approach and supportive therapy for kids who were wrestling with gender identity issues. And he got fired, and he hasn't worked since. And I think that his firing sent a very powerful message to folks in our profession, our community, that departure from the professional society's agenda when it comes to these issues is potentially career-ending. And as medicine has shifted over time, and that there are very few of us left in independent practice, and that most people, are working for larger clinics and larger organizations, I think it's very important for those of us of faith in the profession to network with one another, to be able to encourage one another, to support one another. It's very easy for somebody, if you do what I do for a living and you're teaching at a medical school or you're at a large children's hospital that's embraced this ideology, it's hard to stand alone. And so knowing that there are other people of similar values, one of the most important things that I think that I can do as a Christian physician is that I have a responsibility to represent truth. Jesus calls himself, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Truth has been abdicated at the expense of pursuing a certain political agenda. I don't think that there's ever been a time where it's been more important for those of us, particularly in specialties where we're very vulnerable. My daughter is a resident in OB-GYN, and I will admit I was horrified when she told me that was going to be her career choice because of some of the stands American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology has taken in terms of their lack of respect for human life. And so that I think that we need to be connected with one another just to be able to strengthen and support one another in our faith, to be able to share what are effective strategies for being able to continue to practice within the system in a way that is consistent with our faith and displays integrity with the teaching of the Bible. And I think that if we are going to be a positive force in the larger society, to be able to bring about the change and restore certain things to the practice of medicine that we've lost in the last several decades, we need to be networked together. We need to be collaborating with one another. We need to be encouraging one another. And we need to be platforming one another and to amplify some of these voices within the profession. And I'm grateful that CMDA provides us an opportunity to do that.
Dr. Grcevich, I've heard you and Dr. Josephson one-on-one, and Miriam Grossman and others say, those of us who are very senior have had a career behind us. We're speaking out because we know that those who are younger are at high risk. So let me ask you this question as we conclude. we know that we're in a war here for truth. There's no question about it. And so in a war, especially when the other side has lots of resources, we talk about a resistance. Just give us a few ideas. Our younger listeners who are, whether they're in psychiatry, mental health professionals, what are the elements of pebbles in shoes that right where they are, without putting themselves at high risk, that they can be part of a resistance to this onslaught of truth in this whole area of gender identity?
So one of the things that I think that we can do is that we can offer or make ourselves available, like to mentoring our younger colleagues. And that's something that I would be very open to doing. Part of why I started to speak out is I think that somebody has to go first, and that when individuals within our profession, when Dr. Josephson, when Dr. Grossman, that we have to model and we have to be the change that we desire to see in other people. I think it becomes easier to be brave when you see other people around you demonstrating bravery. And I think back, I think back in my daily Bible reading, the schedule I'm following, I'd be going through the book of Acts. And when you think about the early church, and when they saw the leaders of the church being brave and bold and continuing with the power of the Holy Spirit, to speak out while they were being persecuted, that was a period of time when the church experienced its most rapid growth. And so again, I think that more so than anything else, that we have to model for our younger colleagues, and we have to model for our other colleagues, that we can speak out about these things, and that we know that in the end, Jesus wins and that God wins. And we have to keep all of that in perspective in speaking out and advocating for our patients and advocating for our profession in such a time as this.
Excellent. Dr. Grcevich, thank you for joining us today on CMDA Matters. And wow, Jeff and I could probably spend
no doubt
another hour talking about some of these topics, especially this last one we've been talking about with the transgender delusion. So God bless you, and may He enlarge like the prayer of Jabez, may He enlarge your territory, because there's a lot of pain out there. And may we not cause more pain as those of us who know the truth and are oriented, if I can use that word, to a biblical basis for bioethics.
And may He add many to your number, is my prayer, because we need many like you around the country that will be willing to stand up and mentor the younger and to speak against this, so that eventually we can reach the point where so many European countries have and recognize we are doing far more harm than good for these kids.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, gentlemen. I was honored.
I think there is so much that we could unpack after this thought-provoking interview with Dr. Steve Grcevich. First, I hope that you will take the time to check out Key Ministry, which Steve founded. It focuses on helping families of children with hidden disabilities to feel welcome in their churches. You can find more information at keyministry.org. And like always, we have included a link in our show notes for you today. You can also find your copy of Steve's book on that website. His book is titled Mental Health and the Church, a ministry handbook for including children and adults with ADHD, anxiety, mood disorders, and other common mental health conditions. In this resource, Steve provides a simple and flexible model for mental health inclusion ministry for implementation by churches of all sizes, as well as denominations and organizational styles. I know it's going to be a great resource for lots of churches, so be sure to look for it on their website. Another resource that I want to specifically point out to you are the recordings that we have available in the CMDA Learning Center for 2 recent conferences that we hosted in conjunction with the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. The first was on the topic of gender and identity, and the second was focused on mental health. So much of what we covered in these courses relates to our conversation that we had with Dr. Steve today. So be sure to visit cmda.org/learning to find them. And don't forget, you can earn continuing education credits in our CMDA Learning Center. If you'd like more specific information about the now famous CAS review that we briefly mentioned during our conversation, Dr. Andre Van Mol, he wrote a recent blog post for CMDA focused on the details of this report that's causing quite a stir within the medical community and so-called gender-affirming care. You can find his blog post on CMDA's The Point blog by going to cmda.org/thepoint. And there's a link in our show notes as well. And I've got one last resource to mention. It's actually the webinar that I mentioned during our conversation a few minutes ago. It was an information-packed conversation produced by our wonderful friends at the Colson Center. It was called The Real Facts About Gender Ideology. And it featured today's guest, Dr. Steve Grcevich, as well as Dr. Miriam Grossman, who we've also had the privilege to have on our podcast in the past. This webinar, well, it's about 90 minutes long, but Dr. Grcevich and Dr. Grossman present a boatload of critical content that I think is really important in this battle that is being fought right now in our professional house, CMDA, the house of medical and in particular, psychiatric health science. You can find the link to the Colson Center webinar in our show notes today. Well, God willing, I'm going to be back next Thursday, and I hope that you'll join me for a conversation with a wonderful new friend of CMDA, Dr. Julie Rose. She's a family medicine physician who is quite passionate about healthcare missions, and she recently joined CMDA as our Associate Director of Medical Education International Ministry. We got to sit down a couple of weeks ago and talked about the calling that God has placed upon her life about 20 years into her career to be on mission with her husband cross-culturally, so I invite you to please listen in. At the end of our conversation, Dr. Grcevich gave us such a great testimony about the importance of the community within CMDA. I often like to end these weekly episodes with a testimony from a CMDA member, but this testimony, actually from Dr. Steve, is so good that I want to share it with you one more time. He said, "It's important for those of faith to network and support one another. For those of us in specialties that are vulnerable right now, we need to be connected with one another to strengthen and support one another in our faith. We need to network," Steve said, "collaborate and encourage and amplify our voices within the profession. We have to advocate for our profession at such a time as this." Well, CMDA is the place where you can find community. Community within your specialty, community within your city or region as part of a CMDA chapter, and community as part of a campus ministry on one of 360 schools across the country. If you're not engaged in your CMDA community, let this be a challenge to you, friends. Will you get involved today? As you do so, you're going to find the encouragement and the equipping to bring the hope and healing of Christ to our world. That's what matters to CMDA, and CMDA matters. We'll see you next week, friends, God willing.
Thanks for listening to CMDA Matters. If you would like to suggest a future guest or share a comment with us, please email cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like the podcast, be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share it on your favorite social media platform. This podcast has been a production of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.